The body in the river was still breathing. Lena saw it from the bank where she knelt washing clothes, her knuckles red and raw from the cold water. Not a log, not a dead animal. A man, face half submerged, one arm draped over a rock like he had crawled that far and given up. The current pulled at his legs. Another 10 minutes and the river would have finished what someone else had started. She dropped her washing. The wet shirt hit the mud, and she did not care. She was already ankle-deep in the water, the cold biting through her worn boots, her hands grabbing at the fabric of his coat and pulling. He was heavy, 200 pounds of unconscious weight, and Lena weighed maybe 120 soaking wet, which she currently was. She got him halfway onto the bank, and then slipped, went down hard on one knee in the gravel, and said a word her mother would have slapped her for. She pulled again. His face came out of the water, and she saw the damage. A cut running from his left eyebrow to his temple, deep enough to show bone. His shirt was torn open, and beneath it, more cuts. These were not from a fall. These were not from an accident. Someone had taken a blade to this man with the kind of precision that said they knew where it would hurt most. Lena dragged him up the bank, across the muddy grass, and through the back door of her cottage. She did not have the strength for this. She did it anyway. That was the story of most things in her life. He left a trail of blood and river water across her floor. She got him onto her bed, the only bed. The good blanket, the one her mother had made before the sickness took her, went under him and immediately began soaking through with red. Lena stood there panting, hands shaking, looking at a stranger bleeding out on her dead mother's blanket, and thought, I cannot afford this. She could not afford a doctor because the nearest one was 2 days' ride away. She could not afford the herbs she would need because she had been saving them for winter, which was 8 weeks away, and already breathing down the back of her neck. She could not afford the firewood she would burn, keeping this room warm enough to keep infection from settling into those wounds. She lit the fire, she boiled water, she got her sewing needle and her thinnest thread and she started stitching. He woke once during the stitching. His hand shot up and caught her wrist so fast she did not see it happen. One moment she was pushing the needle through the edge of a wound on his ribs, and the next his fingers were locked around her arm like a shackle. His eyes were open, gray, the color of a winter sky right before it decides to be cruel. They focused on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with training. He was assessing her, cataloging her, deciding in half a second whether she was a threat. Lena held perfectly still. The needle was still in his skin. I am trying to keep you alive, she said. Let go of my hand, or I will leave this needle exactly where it is and go to bed. He let go. His eyes closed. She finished the stitching with hands that trembled only slightly, and she told herself it was the cold. The village found out by morning. Of course it did. Villages like hers had no secrets, only delayed announcements. Old May from the house up the hill saw the blood on Lena's porch. By noon, everyone knew. An unmated Omega had pulled a strange Alpha into her home and kept him overnight. The facts did not matter. The story was already writing itself in their mouths. Lena ignored them. She had practice at this. When your mother dies and your father has been gone since before you could walk, you learn early that other people's opinions are a luxury you cannot afford to carry. The stranger did not wake properly until the third day. She was making soup, the only kind she could make with what she had left, which was mostly water, with some root vegetables that had seen better seasons. She heard the bed frame creak and turned to find him sitting up, his gray eyes moving across the room the way a soldier clears a building. Door, window, back door, distance to each, obstacles between. Then he looked at her. Where am I? He asked. His voice was low and rough from 3 days of silence. My cottage. I pulled you out of the river. How long? 3 days. He looked down at his body. At the stitching she had done with sewing thread, because she did not own surgical supplies. His fingers traced the line of one wound, testing the tension, and something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. Something closer to a professional evaluation. You did this. I did. With what? What I had. He looked at the thread, then at her. You are either very skilled or very stubborn. Both, Lena said. Soup is almost ready. He told her his name was Callum. Nothing else. No family name, no origin, no explanation for why she had found him in a river with knife wounds all over his body. She did not ask. not because she was not curious, but because she understood something about silence that most people did not. Silence was not the absence of a story. It was the story choosing not to be told yet, and pushing at it only made people push back harder. So she fed him soup. She changed his bandages. She burned through herbs she had spent an entire growing season collecting, and every handful she used was a handful she would not have when winter came. He watched her. That was the thing she noticed most. Not staring, not the way Garrett from the next farm over stared at her, all hunger and inventory. Callum watched her the way someone watches a fire in a cold room, like she was warmth, and he had been cold for a very long time. On the fourth day, she came home from trading mending work for bread and found that he had chopped her entire firewood supply into clean, even pieces and stacked them against the wall. He was leaning against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his ribs, sweat on his face. He had torn open 2 of her stitches doing it. "You are an idiot," she said. "Your axe needs sharpening," he replied. She restitched him in silence. Her fingers were steadier this time. On the 6th day, he fixed the door hinge that had been broken since her mother died. He did it without asking. He did it without telling her he had done it. She only noticed because the door stopped screaming every time she opened it, and the silence where the scream used to be felt like a gap in the world. On the 7th day, Garrett came by. Garrett was the closest thing the village had to a leading alpha. Big family, good land, the kind of man who assumed the world was a series of things waiting to belong to him, and the only question was the order of acquisition. He had wanted Lena since they were 15, not wanted as in desired, wanted as in marked for collection. He came to the door. He looked past Lena at Callum, who was sitting at her table cleaning the rust off a set of tools with methodical, unhurried focus. The 2 men looked at each other, the way weather systems look at each other, before one of them becomes a storm. "Who is this?" Garrett said. "A guest," Lena said. "In your home." "That is generally where guests stay, Garrett." His jaw tightened. "People are talking. People have been talking about me since I was 14. I stopped caring at 15. Was there something else?" There was not. Garrett left. But Lena could feel it in the air, the pressure change, the way the village was tightening around her like a fist, closing slow enough that you could pretend it was not happening. That night, she changed Callum's bandages for the last time. The wounds were closing. He was healing faster than any person she had ever seen, which confirmed something she had suspected from the beginning. This was not a farmer. This was not a merchant. This man's body was built for damage, both receiving and delivering it, and whatever life he came from, it was nothing like hers. Her fingers moved across his ribs. The fresh wounds she had stitched sat alongside older scars, layered one over another, years of them. A history written in scar tissue. She traced one without thinking, a long pale line that ran from his side to his back, and his hand came up. Not fast this time, slow. He caught her wrist the way someone catches a falling glass, gently, precisely. She looked up. His gray eyes were open and looking at her, and for the first time since she had dragged him out of that river, he was not assessing or cataloging or calculating distances to exits. He was just looking at her, like she was the only door in the room, and he did not know whether to walk through it or guard it. He let go before she could speak. They did not mention it. 3 days later, Lena woke to the sound of boots, not Callum's. Multiple pairs, moving in formation up the path to her door. She went to the window and saw them. 6 men, armed, wearing leather armor with an insignia she did not recognize, a wolf's head inside a crown of thorns. She turned and Callum was already standing. He was already dressed. He looked like a different person. The wounded man she had been feeding soup and restitching for 11 days was gone. The thing standing in her kitchen was something older, something that understood violence, the way she understood herb gardens, as a native language learned before memory. "They are mine," he said, "not enemies." "Then why do you look like you are about to fight?" "Because the distinction has gotten complicated." He moved toward the door and stopped, turned back to her, crossed the room in 3 strides and took both her hands in his. His hands were rough and warm, and large enough to close entirely around hers. "I will come back for you," he said. It was not a question, it was not a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty with which a person might say the sun will rise. Lena looked at him. At this man she had pulled from a river and stitched together with sewing thread. This man who chopped her wood and fixed her door and watched her like she was warmth. People leave this village all the time, she said. They never come back. That is the only reliable thing about this place. He held her hands for one more second. Then he let go, walked out the door, and disappeared into the tree line with 6 armed men at his back. Lena stood in her kitchen. The cottage was quiet. The door he had fixed did not scream when the wind pushed it. She looked at the bed, at her mother's blanket, stained brown with his blood, ruined beyond saving. She should throw it out, burn it, use it for rags. She folded it instead, carefully, the way her mother used to fold it. She placed it at the foot of the bed. Then she went outside, picked up her washing from the mud, where she had dropped it 3 days ago, and carried it back to the river. The water was just as cold as before. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She washed the clothes anyway. 3 years is a long time when you are poor. 3 years is enough time for a promise to lose its edges, to go from sharp and bright to smooth and vague, like a river stone you keep in your pocket, and touch so often it stops feeling like anything at all. Lena did not wait for Callum. She wanted to be clear about that, mostly to herself. Waiting was for people who could afford to sit still. Lena could not sit still because sitting still meant starving. The herbs she had burned through keeping him alive took 2 full growing seasons to replace. 2 years before her stores were back to what they had been before she pulled a bleeding stranger out of the river. 2 years during which every cough, every fever, every ache she treated for the village women who came to her back door was treated with less than she should have had. She did not complain. Complaining required an audience, and Lena did not have one. What she had was work. Mending clothes for women who whispered about her when her back was turned and smiled when it was not. Gathering roots and bark and leaves for medicines that kept the village healthier than it had any right to be. Trading labor for food because money was something that happened to other people in other places. And she had Garrett. Garrett did not go away after Callum left. Garrett got worse. It started small. A basket of apples left on her porch. A repaired fence post she had not asked to have repaired. The kind of gestures that looked like kindness if you squinted, but felt like a net if you did not. Each gift was a thread, and Garrett was weaving them into something Lena could not refuse without insulting his family, and his family was the closest thing the village had to power. Then the visits. He came by in the mornings. He came by in the evenings. He stood in her doorway and talked about the weather, about the harvest, about the future, and the word future in his mouth always had the shape of a cage. Then the elders. Old May came first. Then the others. One by one, like a receiving line for an occasion Lena had not agreed to attend. They sat at her table and drank her tea, and told her, with the careful voices of people delivering news they believed to be kind, that she should consider Garrett's attention a blessing, that an unmated omega her age was an irregularity, that the village had customs, that customs existed for reasons. The reasons always seemed to involve Lena's body. Her heat cycles became a public discussion. Older women she barely knew asked when her last one had been, offered advice on managing them, suggested that a bonded mate would ease the difficulty. As though her biology was a problem the village needed to solve collectively, Lena stopped going to gatherings. She stopped going to the market on busy days. She reduced her life to the cottage, and the garden, and the river, and the quiet spaces between, and if the world got smaller every month, at least it was hers. She did not think about Callum. That was the lie she told, and she told it well enough that she almost believed it. She did not think about his gray eyes or his rough hands, or the way he said her name like it was a word he had just learned and wanted to practice. She did not think about the scar she had traced across his ribs, or the way his hand had caught her wrist, or the way he had looked at her like she was a door he did not know how to use. She did not think about him, but she kept the blanket. It sat folded at the foot of her bed, brown with old blood, too ruined for any practical purpose. She should have cut it into cleaning rags months ago. She should have burned it in the fire on one of the cold nights when she ran short of wood. She should have done any number of sensible things with it, because Lena was nothing if not sensible. She kept it. She did not examine why. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles north, a war was being fought in back rooms and border towns and the kind of dark places where history gets made before historians are invited to watch. Callum was not a wandering soldier. He was not a mercenary or a fugitive or a man running from trouble. He was the eldest son of the northern king who had been murdered by his own brother 2 years before Callum washed up in Lena's river. The ambush that nearly killed him was orchestrated by his uncle, a man named Pierce, who had seized the throne and declared his nephew dead, with a speed that suggested the declaration had been written before the body was cold. The men who came for Callum at Lena's cottage were loyalists, the last of them. A handful of soldiers who had served his father and refused to bend the knee to the man who killed him. They had been searching for Callum for 3 weeks, following blood trails and rumors and the desperate mathematics of loyalty. They found him. They told him his uncle held the throne. They told him his younger brother had been imprisoned. They told him the kingdom he was born to lead believed he was dead and buried. Callum listened. He asked no questions. He made a decision in the time it takes most men to blink. He would take it back. 3 years. That is how long it took. 3 years of shadow campaigns and border skirmishes and alliances forged in tavern backrooms with men whose trust had to be earned in blood. 3 years of sleeping in different places every night, because staying still meant dying. 3 years of learning that the distance between a rightful king and a hunted fugitive is exactly the width of a crown, and the crown was in his uncle's possession. He was good at war. That was the thing his enemies learned too late. Pierce had expected a young man, raw and grieving and easy to outmaneuver. What he got was something else entirely. Callum fought the way Lena stitched wounds, with whatever he had, with the stubborn precision of someone who did not have the luxury of elegance. His advisors called him relentless. His soldiers called him fair. His enemies called him something worse, and they were not entirely wrong. He won battles he should have lost. He turned enemies into allies with a combination of honesty and the kind of controlled fury that made men want to follow him, rather than face him. He freed his brother from a prison cell beneath the palace in an operation that took 4 men and 11 minutes and left Pierce's most trusted guards unconscious on the floor. He took the capital on a Tuesday. It was raining. His uncle died on the steps of the throne room, not in some grand final duel, but in a brief, ugly scuffle with a man who had simply run out of places to run. History would later clean it up. History always does. Callum took the crown. And every single day of those 3 years, every morning when he woke in a different bed in a different town, every night when he sat over maps and plans and lists of names, he thought about a cottage in a village that did not appear on any of his maps. A woman with red knuckles and a sharp tongue who had sewn him together with thread meant for mending clothes, and never once asked for an explanation. His generals thought his urgency was ambition. His advisors thought it was vengeance. His enemies thought it was bloodlust. None of them were right. Back in the village, the 3rd winter was the hardest. The harvest had been poor, the kind of poor that made even comfortable families count their meals, which meant families like Lena's, which was to say, Lena alone, went from counting meals to skipping them. She ate once a day, sometimes once every 2 days. She told herself it was discipline. It was not discipline. It was mathematics. Garrett's visits increased as the temperature dropped. He brought food now, not gifts, necessities, bread, dried meat, a jar of preserved fruit that must have cost him a week's trade. He put them on her table with the careful patience of a man laying bait in a trap and calling it generosity. "You do not have to live like this," he said. "I know," she said. "I prefer it." His patience was thinning. She could see it in the way his jaw worked when she refused him, in the way his visits got shorter and harder, in the way his gifts got larger and his silences got louder. He was a man who believed he was owed something, and the debt was growing interest. The elders came again. This time their voices were less kind. "You cannot stay unmated forever, Lena. Watch me," she said. But she was tired. The kind of tired that goes past the body and into the part of you that makes decisions. The part that looks at the road ahead and calculates whether you have enough left in you to walk it. She had the blanket. She had the cottage. She had a door that did not scream. She held on. Spring came late and mean, the way spring does in places that have forgotten what kindness looks like. The snow melted into mud, and the mud turned into roads, and the roads brought strangers. Not one stranger this time, an entire convoy. Lena heard about it before she saw it. The village exploded into the kind of chaos that only happens when power arrives at a place that has never seen it up close. Horses, wagons, armed riders in formation, banners she did not recognize bearing a wolf's head inside a crown of thorns. She was in her garden. Her knees were in the dirt. She was planting the season's first herbs with hands that knew the work so well they could do it without her attention, which was good, because her attention was suddenly and completely elsewhere. The village square was 300 yards from her cottage. She could hear the commotion, voices raised in excitement and confusion, the stamp of horses, commands given in crisp, military voices. She did not go to look. Other people's noise was other people's problem. Her hands kept planting. The gate to her garden creaked. She looked up. He stood at the gate, not inside it, at it, like the 3 feet of garden between the gate and where she knelt, was a distance he was asking permission to cross. He was different, broader, harder. 3 years of war had done to his body what 3 years of hunger had done to hers, carved away everything that was not necessary and left only the essential structure. He wore clothing that was not a soldier's and not a farmer's, something between the two that spoke of authority without shouting it. No crown, no jewels. But behind him, visible through the garden gate, a retinue of armed men and advisors arranged themselves the way planets arrange around a sun, and the way they watched him told Lena everything his clothing did not. She stared, trowel in her right hand, dirt on her jaw, her mother's too big shirt hanging off one shoulder. "You are late," she said. Something happened to his face, a crack in the surface. 3 years of war and politics, and the careful mask of command, and her 2 words put a fracture in it that ran from his gray eyes to the corner of his mouth, and the thing underneath was so raw and so real that Lena had to look away from it for a moment. "I know," he said. The village recalibrated in real time. It was remarkable to watch, if you had the stomach for it. The whispers started at the square and moved outward in waves. The strange alpha, the one the Omega girl had sheltered 3 years ago, the scandal, the gossip, the knowing looks and clucked tongues, and quiet suggestions that Lena was something less than respectable. He was the king of the Northern Territories, the man who had overthrown his uncle and reunified the North, and was, by every measure that mattered to people who measured such things, the most powerful alpha on the continent. And he was standing at Lena's garden gate, like a man asking to be let in from the rain. Old May, who had sat in Lena's kitchen 3 months ago and told her she needed to accept Garrett's courtship for the good of the village, could not quite meet Lena's eyes now. None of them could. The elders who had turned her body into a public discussion, the women who had whispered, the men who had watched Garrett circle her with the slow patience of a predator, and said nothing, because his family had land and she did not. They adjusted. They always did. The village rewrote its own history in an afternoon. No one had ever doubted Lena. No one had ever pressured her. No one had ever questioned her choices. Lena noticed. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that could not be changed and were not worth mourning. Garrett. Garrett was standing near the square when Callum walked through. Their eyes met. Lena was not there for it, but she heard about it later from Bess, the woman who sold bread, and the account was brief. The king looked at him, Bess said. Then he looked past him, like Garrett was furniture. That was it. No threat. No confrontation. No growled warning or bared teeth. Callum simply did not see him, did not register him as a thing worth acknowledging. And in that single moment of non-recognition, 3 years of Garrett's careful siege of Lena's life collapsed like a building with no foundation. Garrett did not come to Lena's cottage again. Callum came instead. He sat at her table, the same table where he had cleaned her tools 3 years ago. He drank her tea, which was terrible because she was almost out of dried leaves, and what remained tasted like regret. He did not complain. He told her everything, not the version of events that would later appear in official histories, cleaned and polished and politically convenient. The real version, his father's murder, his uncle's betrayal, the 3 years of war. The blood and the cold and the loneliness that sat in his chest like a stone he could not cough up. He told her who he was, what he had, what he was offering. "I am not asking you to come because I need a queen," he said. "I have advisors for governance. I have generals for war. I have a brother who is better at diplomacy than I will ever be." "Then why?" Lena asked. "Because you pulled me out of a river when you did not have to. You burned a winter's worth of medicine on a stranger who could not even tell you his name. You stitched me together with sewing thread and told me you would leave the needle in my skin if I did not let go of your wrist." He paused. "Because I have been warm once in the last 3 years, and it was in this room." Lena looked at him. At this man who had been a bleeding stranger on her floor and was now a king at her table. The distance between those two things was so vast that her mind kept trying to bridge it and falling short. "I need the night," she said, "to think." He nodded. He stood up. He walked out of her cottage and pitched a tent in the grass behind it, in the exact spot where she had found him in the river 3 years ago. He slept there, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, sleeping on the ground outside of poor Omega's cottage, waiting for her answer. Lena sat on her bed. She looked at the blanket, the blood-stained, ruined, perfectly folded blanket she had kept for 3 years without knowing why. She knew why now. She did not sleep. In the morning, she walked outside with 2 cups of tea. She handed one through the tent flap. "I will go with you," she said. She paused. "But I am bringing the blanket." The road to the capital took 12 days. 12 days of riding in a convoy that moved with the organized efficiency of a small army, because it essentially was one. Lena sat in a wagon that was more comfortable than any piece of furniture she had ever owned, and she watched the landscape change from the gray-green scrub of her village to the rolling farmland of the Middle Territories to the dark forests of the north. She did not speak much during the journey. Callum rode alongside the wagon when he could, which was less often than either of them wanted. He had advisors who needed his attention, generals who needed his approval, messages that arrived by rider at all hours and required decisions that could not wait. Lena watched him work. She saw the way people deferred to him, the way his commands were obeyed without hesitation, the way his presence reorganized every room he entered. This was not the man she had stitched together. That man had been injured, dependent, stripped of everything except his eyes and his hands, and the way he watched her move. This man was a king. She wondered, during the long hours in the wagon, whether the distance between those two men was something she could cross. The capital announced itself before she saw it. The road widened. The traffic thickened. Then the walls appeared, stone and iron, taller than any structure Lena had ever seen. And behind them, the city rose in layers of rooftops and towers and smoke. The palace sat at the center like a heart, stone and dark wood and windows that caught the light like watching eyes. Lena walked through the front door and understood immediately that this was not her world. The floors were polished, the ceilings were vaulted. The walls held paintings of people whose names meant something, to people whose names meant something. Servants moved through the corridors in pressed uniforms, with the silent efficiency of a system that had been running long before she arrived and would run long after she left. She owned 3 dresses. All of them had been mended at least twice. Her shoes had holes she had patched with leather from a belt she no longer wore, because the belt was now part of her shoes. She was standing in a hallway that cost more than her entire village. The first person to greet her was a woman named Vivienne Omega. Tall, polished, dressed in fabric that moved like water, and probably cost the same. She had the kind of face that had never been worried about where its next meal was coming from, and she smiled at Lena with a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "You must be Lena," Vivienne said. "We have heard so much about you." The way she said it made so much sound like, not enough to justify this. Lena smiled back. "I hope the truth was at least as interesting as whatever they made up." Vivienne's smile held, but something behind it shifted, the way a cat shifts when it realizes the mouse has seen it. Lena was shown to a room that was larger than her entire cottage. A bed with 4 posts and curtains. A wardrobe full of clothes in her size, which meant someone had measured her without her knowing. A window that overlooked the palace gardens, green and manicured and impossibly orderly. She put the blanket on the bed, the blood-stained, brown-spotted, obviously ruined blanket, on top of silk sheets in a room that smelled like lavender. It looked ridiculous. She left it there. The court was a different kind of survival. Lena had spent her whole life learning how to survive poverty, how to stretch a meal, how to read the weather, how to tell which mushrooms would feed you and which would kill you. These were useful skills. None of them applied here. Here, the dangers wore silk and smiled while they cut you. Here, words had second meanings and third meanings, and sometimes the thing someone said to you over dinner was actually a weapon disguised as a compliment, so well that you did not feel the wound until later that night, when you replayed the conversation and realized you had been insulted, dismissed, and evaluated all in the same sentence. Vivian was the architect. She was the daughter of a powerful house, one of the oldest families in the North. She had been raised from birth with one purpose: to become the queen. It was not a dream, it was a plan. And the plan had been on track until Callum had taken the throne and failed, spectacularly and publicly, to choose her. She did not attack Lena. That would have been too obvious and too crude for someone of her training. Instead, she included her. She invited her to events, teas, gatherings, social functions where every other Omega in attendance had been educated in court etiquette since childhood, and Lena had been educated in how to cauterize a wound with a heated knife. Lena used the wrong utensils at her first formal dinner. She did not know the protocols for addressing visiting dignitaries. She spoke directly when she should have implied, and her directness, which had been a weapon in the village, was a liability here. Every time she said what she meant, the court heard an Omega who did not know how to play the game. Vivian helped. She corrected Lena's mistakes with gentle guidance. She explained the rules with patient kindness. She provided tutors and advisors, and a personal attendant who dressed Lena every morning in clothes that fit perfectly and felt like costumes. It took Lena 3 weeks to see the trap. Vivian was not teaching her to survive the court. Vivian was teaching her to need Vivian. Every correction was a thread. Every act of guidance was a leash. Every kindness was a reminder that Lena could not do this alone, and the person holding her up could just as easily let her fall. Lena recognized the structure. She had grown up poor, but she had not grown up stupid. Poverty teaches you one thing above all else. It teaches you to tell the difference between someone who is feeding you and someone who is fattening you for something else. She stopped attending Vivian's events. She went to the kitchen instead. The kitchen staff did not care about court politics. They cared about whether the bread was rising and whether the roast was burning and whether anyone had remembered to bring up more wine from the cellar. They were blunt and busy, and they treated Lena like a person rather than a symbol, which was the most refreshing thing that had happened to her since she arrived. Bess, not the bread seller from the village, but a different Bess, a coincidence that made Lena smile every time she thought about it. This Bess was the head cook, a woman built like a wardrobe, with arms that could carry 2 full stockpots without effort, and a voice that could cut through a crowded kitchen like a blade through butter. Bess liked Lena because Lena knew how to peel a potato. "You would be amazed," Bess said. "How many people in this palace have never peeled a potato in their lives?" Lena laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving. She made friends with the stable hands next, then the groundskeepers, then the laundry workers. She built relationships from the bottom up, connecting with the people who actually ran the palace, the ones who controlled the food and the horses, and the clean sheets and the fires. And she did it without strategy or calculation, because this was how survival worked. You secure the people who control the essentials. Everything else is decoration. Callum watched this happen. He watched her navigate the court with the same focused attention he had once used to watch her move through her cottage. She was learning, adapting, refusing to perform the role that the court had written for her, the role of grateful rescued Omega, humble and overwhelmed and appropriately awed by her good fortune. She was not grateful. She was working. He loved her for it. He had not told her that yet. The word sat in his chest like a second heartbeat, present and persistent, and not yet ready to be spoken. There were political complications. There were advisors who frowned and generals who shook their heads, and an entire court that had expected him to choose differently. Edmund, his chief advisor, laid it out plainly. The Northern Alliance was built on the assumption that you would bond with a house of standing. Vivian's family supported your campaign. They financed your war. They did not do this out of charity. "I know," Callum said. "Then you understand that choosing a village Omega with no family, no resources, and no political value is not simply a personal decision. It is a governance decision. I know that too. And she pulled me out of a river and saved my life with sewing thread and never once asked me for anything. Not my name, not my story, not my gratitude. She gave me everything she could not afford to give, and then she went back to washing her clothes in cold water." Edmund looked at him for a long time. "That is a love story," Edmund said. "It is not a policy. Then I will make it both." The formal dinner happened on a Thursday, the kind of event designed to display the court's power and refinement to visiting dignitaries from the Eastern Territories. Long tables, silver plates, 6 courses, the kind of food Lena had never seen in her life, dishes with names she could not pronounce, made from ingredients she could not identify. She sat at Callum's right hand. She wore a green dress that Vivian's attendant had selected for her, which should have been her first warning, because Vivian's attendant had never selected anything for her that was not part of a larger design. The dinner went well for the first 3 courses. Lena kept her mouth shut and her eyes open, and her hands in her lap when she was not sure which utensil to use, which was a strategy that worked better than most people would expect. Then the toast. Vivian stood. She held her glass with the practiced elegance of someone who had been holding glasses at formal dinners since she was 12. She smiled. The room quieted. "To our king," she said, "and to his most unexpected choice." Laughter. The polite, controlled kind. The kind that lets everyone in the room acknowledge what they are all thinking without anyone having to say it directly. Lena looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back. The smile was perfect. The eyes were ice. Lena did not react. She raised her glass. She drank. She set the glass down with a hand that did not shake. The dinner continued. But later, when the tables were being cleared and the guests were milling in the great hall with drinks and conversations that doubled as negotiations, Lena passed close to Callum, close enough to catch his scent, which she had learned in the cottage, the particular warmth of it, the way it grounded her even when she did not want to be grounded. Something was wrong. There was another scent on him, on his collar, faint but deliberate. A perfume she recognized because it was the same perfume that filled every room Vivian entered, floral and expensive, and applied with the precision of a weapon. Lena's chest went cold. She did not confront him. She did not cry. She did not make a scene. She had spent her entire life not making scenes because scenes were a luxury for people who could afford the fallout. She went to her room, she sat on the bed, she picked up the blanket, the blood-stained, folded blanket, and she held it in her lap and smoothed the fabric with her fingers. She sat like that for 20 minutes. Then she started packing. She did not have much to pack. 3 dresses from the village, the ones she had arrived in, her mother's shirt, a pouch of dried herbs, force of habit, the blanket, the silk clothes, the green dress, the room full of someone else's taste. She left all of it. She was halfway to the door when it opened. Callum stood in the frame. His eyes went from her face to the bag in her hand, to the empty wardrobe, to the folded blanket sitting on top of her things. He processed this information in the time it took to draw one breath. He closed the door behind him. And then the king of the Northern Territories sat on the floor. Not in a chair, not on the bed. On the stone floor, his back against the door, his knees drawn up, his hands hanging between them. He looked up at her from below, and the posture said everything his words had not yet found. "Vivian's perfume," he said, "on my collar." Lena did not move. She touched my arm during the reception, briefly, publicly, the kind of contact that could be accidental. It was not accidental. "I know," Lena said. "Her family financed my war. There was a political arrangement before you. Before the river. Before any of this. An understanding between families that when I took the throne, she would stand beside it. I know that too. I ended it the day I took the crown. She has spent 3 years pretending I did not." Lena looked at him, at this man on the floor, the most powerful person in the territory, sitting on cold stone, looking up at her with gray eyes that held the same expression they had held in her cottage when his hand caught her wrist. Not command, not authority. The raw, terrified honesty of a man who has found the one thing he cannot afford to lose and realizes he may already be losing it. "You should have told me," she said. "I did not want you to have to carry it. That was not your decision to make." The sentence sat between them like a blade on a table. Both of them could see it. Neither of them picked it up. "No," he said. "It was not." Silence. "I am not leaving because of her perfume," Lena said. "I am leaving because you kept it from me. You decided what I needed to know. You decided what I could handle. You made me smaller so you could protect me. And I have spent my entire life being made small by people who said they were doing it for my own good." He did not argue. He did not defend. He sat on the floor and took it, and the taking was not weakness. It was the hardest thing she had ever watched a powerful person do. "What do you need?" he asked. "Access," she said. "To everything. The political records, the court alliances, the financial arrangements. Everything you know, I know. Everything that affects my position, I see before anyone else does. Not after, not filtered, not edited for my comfort. Done. I am not finished." He waited. "You do not protect me from information. You do not protect me from politics. You do not protect me from Vivienne. If she is my problem, I solve her. Not you. Not your generals. Not your advisors. Me." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his eyes. Something that might have been pride, or might have been fear, or might have been the particular agony of loving someone who refuses to be rescued. "Done," he said. Lena put down the bag. She did not unpack it, not yet. She left it by the door, as a reminder, to herself and to him, that the option existed. She sat on the bed, he stayed on the floor. They did not touch. It was enough. The political records arrived the next morning. 3 crates of documents carried into her room by 2 exhausted clerks, who clearly had not been told why the King's Omega needed access to classified governance materials and were too well trained to ask. Lena looked at the crates the way she had once looked at a winter's worth of herbs that needed cataloging. A large task, an essential one, the kind that rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. She started reading. The girl who could not afford dinner taught herself governance in 6 weeks. She read the alliance treaties. She read the trade agreements. She read the financial records that showed exactly how much Vivienne's family had invested in Callum's war and exactly what they expected in return. She read the letters between advisors, the meeting notes, the formal complaints filed by noble houses who objected to their king choosing a village Omega. She read it all. She understood maybe half of it at first, then 3/4. Then, by the end of the 6th week, nearly everything. She went to Edmund. "I have questions," she said. Edmund, who had privately opposed her presence since she arrived, looked at her with the wary expression of a man who has just realized he has been underestimating someone. "Ask them," he said. She asked 37 questions in 2 hours. They ranged from trade policy to military logistics to the specific legal mechanisms by which a mating bond affected succession rights. Edmund answered every one. By the end, his expression had changed from wariness to something closer to respect, which is the face a professional makes when they encounter competence they did not expect. "You read all of them," he said. "I read all of them. The king said you would. The king was right." Lena found Vivienne on a Tuesday. Not at a formal dinner, not at a court event, not in any of the stages Vivienne had built for their encounters. The carefully designed social arenas where the rules were Vivienne's, and the audience was Vivienne's, and the outcome was always Vivienne's. Lena found her in the garden, alone. Early morning, Vivienne was sitting on a bench near the roses, reading a letter, and she looked up with the composed surprise of someone who has just been ambushed in the one place they felt safe. "Walk with me," Lena said. It was not a request. The tone made that clear. Vivienne heard it, and something flickered across her face. A recalculation happening in real time. They walked. The garden was empty, except for a groundskeeper Lena knew by name, a man called Ned, who was pruning hedges and pretending not to listen with the professional commitment of someone who had been pretending not to listen in this garden for 30 years. Lena did not build up to it. She did not circle the point, or soften the approach, or perform any of the diplomatic choreography the court valued. She had spent her whole life speaking directly, and she was done pretending that was a flaw. "He chose me when he had nothing," Lena said. "He was bleeding on my floor. He did not know if he would live through the week. He had no crown, no army, no title, nothing except a body full of knife wounds and a name he would not tell me. And in that moment, with nothing to offer and nothing to gain, he looked at me and decided I was worth coming back for." She stopped walking. Vivienne stopped with her. "You wanted him when he had everything. The crown, the power, the throne. You wanted the position, not the person. And there is nothing wrong with that. Ambition is not a sin. But do not pretend that what you are doing is love. And do not pretend that what I have can be replicated by applying perfume to his collar." Vivienne said nothing. "We are not in the same conversation," Lena said. We never were. She walked away. Vivian's campaign collapsed over the following weeks. Not because Lena outmaneuvered her politically. Vivian was still better at court politics, and would always be. It collapsed because Lena had made visible the one thing Vivian could not fabricate: the origin, the river, the blood, the 11 days. A bond forged in mutual vulnerability, not mutual advantage. The court saw it. The nobles who had whispered about the village Omega began to whisper differently. Not because Lena had become one of them, but because she had become something they could not ignore. A woman who read 3 crates of political records in 6 weeks. A woman who befriended the kitchen staff before she befriended a single noble. A woman who confronted her rival in a garden and said what needed to be said with the clean, direct economy of someone who had never had enough of anything to waste, including words. Vivian left court 2 months later. She married into an Eastern house that valued her skills and appreciated her ambition. Lena sent a gift, a good one. She could afford good gifts now, but she chose one that had nothing to do with money, a collection of pressed herbs from the palace garden, the kind Lena grew on every windowsill she could reach, labeled in her own handwriting. Vivian sent a note back. 1 line, well played. Lena smiled. It had not been play, but she understood why Vivian needed to see it that way. The bonding ceremony happened in spring. Callum offered a public celebration, a royal event, banners and feasts and dignitaries from every territory, the kind of spectacle that kingdoms use to announce themselves to the world. Lena said no. I want the cottage, she said. Callum looked at her. Our cottage, she said. My cottage, the one with the door you fixed. I want to go back there. They went back. The village had changed. Not much, and not quickly. The way villages change, like trees growing. So slow you cannot see it happening, but undeniable over time. The road was better. There were more houses. A small building that served as a school sat at the edge of the square, paid for with royal funds that Lena had personally allocated from the governance budget she now helped manage. Her cottage was the same. Repaired and winterized, the roof patched and the walls reinforced, but otherwise unchanged. The same rooms, the same kitchen, the same bed. The blanket was on the bed, washed clean, finally, after 3 years of carrying his blood in its fibers. The stains had not come out entirely, they never would. But they had faded to a soft, brownish pattern that looked, if you did not know better, like part of the original design. They bonded in that room, in the quiet, in the cottage where she had saved his life, with sewing thread and stubbornness, and the particular courage of a woman who could not afford to let a stranger die. No banners, no feasts, no audience. Just 2 people in a small room making a promise that one of them had made 3 years ago at a garden gate, and had spent every day since working to keep. The court adjusted. It always does. Lena became the queen who answered her own door. The queen who kept herbs growing on every windowsill in the palace, because the smell reminded her of her mother, and the practice reminded her of who she was. The queen who remembered what it cost to choose between firewood and dinner and governed accordingly, with the fierce, practical compassion of someone who knows that policy is not an abstraction, but a meal on someone's table, or the absence of one. She established a network of healers in the outlying villages, trained and supplied from the palace's resources. She reformed the trade routes so that small communities were not cut off by winter. She personally reviewed every budget allocation related to food security because she knew what hunger looked like from the inside, and she would not allow it to happen to someone else if she had the power to prevent it. Edmund, who had once called her a love story and not a policy, became her most reliable advisor. He had the political training she lacked. She had the ground-level understanding he had never been forced to acquire. Together, they were effective in the way that 2 incomplete things can become complete when combined. Callum became the king who waited in the garden. It was not an official title. It was a story that people told, at first in the capital, and then further out, spreading the way stories do when they carry a truth people need to hear. The king who waited. The king who sat on the floor. The king who slept in the dirt outside a poor woman's cottage because she asked for a night to think, and he gave it to her without question. It was a good story. Lena knew it was a story, and stories are always simpler and cleaner than the truth. The truth was messier. The truth included 3 years of hunger and loneliness, and a door that did not scream anymore because a stranger had fixed it, and she could not decide whether the silence was a comfort or a wound. The truth included a man on a floor and a bag by a door, and a conversation about respect that was harder than any battle either of them had fought. But the story was useful, and Lena, who had learned to be practical before she learned to be anything else, allowed it to be told. The village elders never quite managed to look her in the eye again. They came to the cottage when the bonding was announced. They brought flowers and smiles and warm words, and they stood in her kitchen and pretended that they had always known, always believed, always supported her. Lena served them tea. She was polite. She was gracious. She did not remind them of the visits, the pressure, the way they had discussed her body in her own kitchen, as though she were not attached to it. She did not forgive them either. Forgiveness, like waiting, was a luxury. What she offered instead was something more durable. She offered them a road and a school and a medical station, and she did it not because they deserved it, but because the children in that village deserved it, and the next girl who grew up poor and alone in that place would have options that Lena never had. Old May sent a letter after the bonding. It was long and full of apologies, dressed up as blessings. Lena read it once. She put it in a drawer. She did not reply. Some things do not need a response. Some silences say everything. Garrett married a woman from the next valley. Lena heard about it through Bess, the bread seller, not the cook, the original Bess, who sent word via a merchant passing through the capital. The wedding was small. The bride was young. Lena wished her well, and meant it. The kind of genuine, uncomplicated well-wishing you can only feel toward a person who is no longer your problem. On quiet nights, when the palace was dark and the fires were low and the weight of governance was set aside until morning, Lena and Callum sat in their chambers and talked. Not about policy or alliances or the 100 daily decisions that running a kingdom required. They talked about small things, the garden, the weather, the particular way the light came through the windows of a cottage that was now maintained by royal staff, but still smelled like herbs and wood smoke. Sometimes they did not talk at all. On one of those nights, Lena pulled the blanket from the foot of the bed and spread it over them. It was too small for the bed, too old and too worn for a palace, too stained to be anything other than what it was. Evidence. Evidence that a poor Omega had once made a choice that made no sense. Evidence that she had burned a winter's supply of medicine for a stranger. Evidence that kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, is not a weakness but a seed. And seeds, given time, grow into things that change the shape of the land. Callum looked at the blanket, at the faded stains that would never come clean. "You kept it," he said. "I keep everything that matters," she said. Outside the window, the capital was quiet. The kingdom was at peace. The road to a small village in the south was clear and well-maintained, and in the morning, a shipment of medical supplies would travel down it to a new clinic, staffed by healers, who had been trained by a program the Queen had personally designed. Lena closed her eyes. Callum's arms settled around her, heavy and warm, and the blanket covered them both. It was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales are clean. This was a life, messy and hard-won and full of choices, that had cost her more than anyone would ever know. It was hers. She had earned every part of it.